there are unfortunately many people, many ship owners in Western countries and elsewhere who are willing to sell their ships to the shadow fleet. Considering what is happening in Ukraine, that is a deeply immoral position to take.
I think the first question really is, what exactly is Russia's shadow fleet and how big is it?
So it is a collection of vessels that transport especially oil on behalf of Russian oil to its destinations. And the reason it's a shadow fleet is that these vessels are transporting oil above the price cap, which is, of course, the most lucrative way for Russia to earn money. The oil price cap is essentially a sanction that Western governments introduced on Russian oil early on in the war. And the way it works is that Western governments sanction Russian oil above $60 per barrel. So Western countries are not allowed, Western countries and companies in our countries are not allowed to buy under this sanction Russian oil above the price. And the reason it needs these vessels is that officially sailing vessels have various forms of insurance, including most crucially in this context, accident insurance, what's known as P&I insurance. And that insurance, those insurance companies are virtually all based in Western countries, and Western companies based in Western countries have to obviously obey Western sanctions. So that means that vessels sailing officially, because they use these insurers, cannot transport Russian oil above the price cap. And Western countries, Western governments thought that if they introduce this price cap, that would mean that Russia won't be able to export oil above the price cap. But what they didn't realize was that Russia would turn to the shadow fleet, which is what it has done. So what these vessels are is they don't have proper insurance. They are old. They've been sold by officially operating shipping companies to obscure owners, very obscure owners. So you have obscure owners, insufficient insurance, old vessels, and because these vessels are up to no good, they often disguise their whereabouts. They manipulate or turn off their automatic identification systems. And these kinds of vessels have existed for a long time. Russia didn't come up with the idea of shadow vessels, but before the Ukraine war, the number of shadow vessels was quite limited. It was essentially vessels transporting things to and from Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and some Latin American drug gangs. That was it. And so it was around 200, slightly less than 200. That was the estimate. But since Russia invaded Ukraine and the price cap was imposed, the fleet has exploded in size. And now it's thought to comprise more than 1,000 vessels in the oil tanker sector alone. And there are other shadow vessels as well. So it's about 17% of all oil tankers worldwide are now part of the shadow fleet.
And is it just oil, or are they also carrying other fuel or resources as well?
Shadow vessel traffic going from Russia transports oil simply because that's Russia's most important source of revenue. It needs to keep exporting oil above the price cap to make money. And so that is the most important aspect. But other goods that are sanctioned, Western goods that are sanctioned or banned by Western governments from Russia, find their way to Russia in similar ways.
Where are they taking off from, and where are they going to?
Typically, they sail out of Russia's Baltic Sea ports. They sail through the Baltic Sea, through the Danish Straits, and then out into the North Sea, the Atlantic, and so forth, and then often through the Suez Canal and onto their destinations. And their destinations are typically India and China. Turkey is also a main, quite important importer of Russian oil above the price cap, as is the UAE. So we are talking about quite a long route that these ships have to take, but it usually begins in the Baltic Sea because they have to leave Russia's Baltic ports to get out to those larger waters. And that puts the Baltic Sea countries in a very perilous position because you have a daily procession of shadow vessels sailing through the Baltic Sea.
So what kind of threats does a shadow fleet pose?
The first risk shadow vessels pose is that because they are very old and because they're poorly maintained, they often experience accidents of some kind. There are fires, their engines stop working, they have minor oil leaks, and it's a miracle that we haven't had a major oil leak yet or oil spill, but we will have one. We had a couple of years ago, we had a shadow vessel that exploded and sank, and it was only by pure luck that vessel didn't have oil on board. It had just delivered its cargo of oil to the port to which it was sailing, and it was now on its way back to Russia to collect more oil, and that's when it exploded. Then they pose a collision hazard to other vessels. So because they frequently turn off or disguise or manipulate their automatic identification systems, other ships have trouble knowing where they are. AIS is there for ships to communicate their location to other ships so that collisions can be avoided. If you manipulate your AIS, the ships around you have no way of knowing where you are. So they may see that you are in a particular location, but they can't know that you are in a completely different location. So that increases the risk of collisions. And then on top of that, we have the risk of these vessels just having accidents on their own because they are in such poor repair. And that means that the coastal state then has to sail out, its coast guard has to sail out and try to rescue the crew, rescue the ship at great expense to the coastal state. And then perhaps in the longer term, it is a considerable threat to the global maritime order.
So Europe has pledged to take more action this year, including drafting new legislation to clamp down on the shadow fleet. What exactly is Europe doing, and what options does it have?
So what the US, UK, and the EU have been trying to do is to sanction individual vessels, and that makes it much harder for them to sail. But the problem with that is that the moment you sanction a shadow vessel, another vessel enters the shadow fleet. There are unfortunately many people, many ship owners in Western countries and elsewhere who are willing to sell their ships to the shadow fleet because they have ships that are nearing retirement, and they decide for themselves that they would rather make money on that ship nearing retirement than having to pay to have it scrapped. And that is, I think, considering what is happening in Ukraine, that is a deeply immoral position to take, because your actions allow Russia to continue waging its war against Ukraine. If nobody were willing to sell vessels to the shadow fleet, there would be no shadow fleet. Russia would make no money. So I think the sanctions against individual vessels, there's nothing wrong with them, but they are not particularly effective. And now the EU has said it will try to detain more shadow vessels on environmental grounds. And yes, there are environmental reasons to detain them, because in many cases they are not seaworthy. Then you do have the right to detain them and until such a time that its owners, the respective ship's owners, have paid for the repairs necessary for them to become seaworthy. The problem with that, though, is we're talking about so many vessels, about more than 1,000 vessels. And if you were to detain those vessels, you as a coastal state would have to store them in your ports or somewhere else. We just don't have that capacity in our ports or elsewhere for hundreds of vessels to essentially be there, and by the way, be looked after by our authorities, because the owners are so obscure that we will not be able to find them, and they will walk away from these vessels. You can't just sink it to the bottom of the Baltic Sea, especially considering that these are oil tankers, but there are also rules about how you scrap vessels. So that is the practical reason. And unfortunately, people, ordinary citizens, I think, often don't realize just how difficult it is to, what the hurdles are to first of all, detain a vessel and then to get it seaworthy again, or what else to do. They think Western governments are just being spineless. It is extremely complicated.
Ukraine recently took things a step forward by sanctioning 57 captains of Shadow Fleet vessels. Why is that different from sanctioning the vessels themselves?
When it comes to ship captains, there's a limited supply of experienced ship captains, and we are obviously talking about humans compared to inanimate objects. And so you can't just replace 57 shipmasters. And on top of that, these shipmasters will have a home country that will intervene on their, or will get concerned on their behalf. They will have families and so forth. So it is actually much more powerful detaining, on legal grounds, of course, ship crews than it is to try to intervene against the ships themselves.
Have we seen any positive effects from the sanctions?
So what we saw recently was China and India essentially suspending some purchases of Russian oil, and we don't know why they did that. We don't know whether it is that they have grown tired of the Shadow Fleet. They've realized the risks posed by the Shadow Fleet, not just to coastal states, but to the global maritime order on which they also depend, or whether it was some sort of signal to Putin that he can't take them for granted, or whether it was a signal to Donald Trump of some kind. We just don't know, or whether it was just that they had enough oil at that moment and they just didn't need to import more. And I would love to be a fly on the wall in the rooms where those conversations were taken, were made, because it came very surprisingly, this decision by these two countries. But unfortunately, it is also the case that even if China and India were to stop buying Russian oil, there are other countries that are willing to buy it. And this matters because for other countries, the countries that haven't joined the price cap coalition, for them, this oil is legal. The way it's transported is not legal, but buying it is not illegal. The most worrying thing about the Shadow Fleet is that before the Ukraine war, we had a pretty well-functioning global maritime order. It wasn't perfect, and it was, in fact, being undermined in different ways by China in particular. But we didn't have a parallel fleet of concern. We had a small Shadow Fleet, but it was so small that it could be managed. Since the introduction of the oil price cap, the Shadow Fleet has grown like a tumor. And what we have today are two parallel fleets on the world's oceans, the officially sailing one and the Shadow one. And what the existence of the Shadow one signals to other countries and companies is that you don't have to follow the rules and you don't have to pay the significant amounts of money involved in maintaining your vessel. You can just sail rickety old rust buckets until they fall apart, and nobody can do anything about it. And I think that is the really frightening thing, that we have two fleets operating in parallel, and one is law-abiding, the other is not law-abiding. One is more expensive to maintain, the other one is very cheap to maintain, and yet there is no punishment for those who engage in the Shadow Fleet.
Thanks so much for watching this video, and a big thank you to our members who make interviews like this possible. If you want to keep supporting independent media in Ukraine, then head over to our website and you can sign up as a member there.